This content is presented for educational, historical, and cultural analysis purposes. All theological interpretations shared here reflect the views of various scholars and traditions, and should be understood as according to the interpretation of unredacted rather than absolute doctrinal claims. Viewers are encouraged to study, verify, and form their own understanding through personal research and spiritual guidance.
What if one of the most overlooked instructions in all of ancient scripture was actually one of the most personally relevant passages you could ever read? Not a prophecy, not a parable, just a practical command, and quite almost technical, tucked inside the ancient priestly laws of Israel. The fire on the altar shall be kept burning on it. It shall not go out. That's Leviticus 6, 12, and 13. And according to the interpretation of countless theologians, historians, and spiritual thinkers across centuries, those two verses describe something far deeper than a campfire. Today we're going to explore what that ancient flame possibly meant to the people of Israel, how it has been interpreted across different traditions, and, according to many spiritual perspectives, what it might still mean for the inner life of a person today. This is not a sensational video. There are no shock claims here. What we have instead is a slow walk through one of the most symbolically rich images in the ancient world, a fire that was never allowed to go out. Stay with me. Part 1. The text itself. What does Leviticus 6:12 to 13 actually say? Music softens further. Teaching tone begins. Let's start where we should always start, with the actual text. Leviticus, the third book of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament, is largely a book of priestly instructions. It was addressed, according to tradition, to the Levitical priests, the religious specialists of ancient Israel, whose responsibility was to maintain the worship practices of the community. Chapter 6 deals specifically with what scholars call the laws of the offerings. It's one of the most detailed passages in the entire Torah regarding the daily operations of the tabernacle, and later, by extension, the Jerusalem temple. Here is Leviticus 6, 12, and 13 from the English Standard Version. The fire on the altar shall be kept burning on it. It shall not go out. The priest shall burn wood on it every morning, and he shall arrange the burnt offering on it, and shall burn on it the fat of the peace offerings. Fire shall be kept burning on the altar continually. It shall not go out. Notice a few things right away. First, this is a command addressed to a priest. The action required, feeding the fire with wood, is described as a morning ritual. It's not a one-time event. It's not a special occasion. It is a daily, repeating act of intention. Second, the word continually is key. In the original Hebrew, the word used is tamid, which means regularly, always, or perpetually. This same word appears in other priestly contexts in Leviticus and Numbers to describe offerings and duties that were to never be interrupted. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the text repeats itself. Verse 12 says, "The fire shall not go out." Verse 13 says it again. According to the interpretation of many biblical scholars, this kind of repetition in Hebrew literature is not accidental. It is emphasis. It is weight. It is the text saying this matters more than you might think. So what was this fire exactly? Part 2, the historical and cultural context of the sacred fire. Music shifts slightly, more curious, exploratory tone. To understand the significance of the fire in Leviticus, we need to step back and look at the broader, ancient, Near Eastern world in which these texts were composed and preserved. Across cultures of the ancient world, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Canaanite, Persian, fire held an almost universal sacred significance. It was understood not merely as a physical phenomenon, but as a mediating force between the visible and invisible worlds. Fire transformed things. It consumed the physical and released something unseen: smoke, heat, light, upward. According to ancient cosmological thinking shared by many cultures, this upward direction was associated with the divine realm. Offerings placed in fire were understood in various traditions as being sent to the gods. In ancient Egypt, eternal flames were maintained in temples as representations of the divine presence. The Zoroastrian tradition of ancient Persia, one of the world's oldest living religions, maintains sacred fires that have reportedly been burning for over 1,000 years. Fire temples in India and Iran still tend these flames today. In ancient Rome, the Vestal Virgins were specifically charged with maintaining the eternal flame of the goddess Vesta. The extinguishing of that flame was considered a catastrophic omen, a sign of divine displeasure or civic disaster. So when we encounter Leviticus 6:12-13, we are not reading an isolated instruction. We are reading a text that speaks into a world already deeply attuned to the language of sacred fire. What made Israel's altar fire distinct, according to its own textual tradition, was its origin. Leviticus 9:24 records what many traditions interpret as the inaugural moment of the altar fire. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat pieces on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. According to the interpretation of the text itself, the original flame was not lit by human hands. It descended from a divine source. And the command in Leviticus 6 was, in essence, do not let that fire go out. Well, this is why, according to many Jewish and Christian interpreters, the command carries such theological weight. The fire was understood to be not merely functional but sacred in origin. Letting it die would not have been merely negligent. It would have been symbolically a severing of the connection it represented. Part 3. Rabbinic and Jewish interpretations of the eternal flame. Music continues, reflective, scholarly tone. The fire of the altar has been a subject of deep reflection in Jewish thought for millennia. The Mishnah, the foundational rabbinic legal text compiled around 200 CE, discusses the logistics of the altar fire extensively. The tractate Tamid, whose very name means the continual offering, describes in careful detail how the priests maintained the fire throughout the night and refreshed it each morning. The rabbis of the Talmudic era posed a fascinating question. If the fire descended miraculously from heaven, why were priests commanded to add wood every morning? Was the divine fire not sufficient on its own? Their answer, as recorded in various Talmudic discussions, was essentially this: yes, the divine fire was sufficient, but the human participation was the point. The wood added by the priest was not fuel for an insufficient flame. It was an act of conscious collaboration. The priest was, in the interpretation of many sages, saying through his action, I acknowledge this fire. I am choosing, again today, to tend it. I am partnering in what began beyond me. This interpretation has echoed through Jewish mystical tradition as well. In Kabbalistic thought, the perpetual fire has been read as a symbol of divine light maintained within the human soul, the neshama, or spiritual dimension of the person. Some Kabbalistic texts suggest that every human being carries, so to speak, an inner altar, and that daily spiritual practice, prayer, intention, study, acts of kindness, is the wood placed on that altar each morning. To Rabbi Samson, Raphael Hirsch, a 19th century Orthodox thinker and commentator, offered an interpretation worth considering here. According to his analysis, the perpetual fire of the altar represented the perpetual aspiration of Israel, not a perfect state already achieved, but a directional orientation continually renewed. The fire, he suggested, could only remain alive through intentional, repeated acts of devotion. That interpretation, while rooted in traditional Jewish thought, carries implications that many readers across traditions have found resonant. Part 4. Early Christian interpretations. From literal to spiritual music. Shifts subtly. Warmer, more pastoral. In the early centuries of the Christian tradition, on the Hebrew scriptures, which Christians received as the Old Testament, were read through what scholars call a typological lens. That is, many early church fathers interpreted events, objects, and others interpreted events, objects, and instructions from the Hebrew Bible as prefiguring or pointing toward Christ, the church, or the inner spiritual life. The perpetual fire of the altar was no exception. Origen of Alexandria, writing in the 3rd century CE, offered one of the earliest extended Christian commentaries on Leviticus. He interpreted the altar fire spiritually, suggesting, according to his reading, that the fire of God was meant to be understood as the presence of the Holy Spirit within the believer. Letting the fire go out, in his interpretation, meant allowing spiritual apathy, sin, or neglect to gradually extinguish the inner divine presence. What is fascinating about Origen's reading is how closely it tracks the rabbinic reading described earlier, despite coming from a very different tradition. Both see the altar fire as an inner reality, not merely an outer ritual. This interpretive thread continues into the New Testament text itself, which predates the formal Christian commentaries. The Apostle Paul, in his first letter to the Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians 5:19, writes, "Do not quench the Spirit." Many commentators across centuries have read this verse as the New Testament echo of Leviticus 6:13. The fire is still burning. The instruction is still, don't let it go out. Paul's letter to the Romans uses similar fire imagery in chapter 12, verse 11. Where, in the original Greek, he urges his readers to be boiling in spirit, a phrase often translated as fervent in spirit or aglow with the Spirit. The Greek word used, zeontes, specifically word used, zeontes, specifically evokes the image of boiling liquid or active flame. Not a controlled candle, a fire that moves. Part 5. What causes the fire to dim? Historical and spiritual patterns. Music becomes slightly more contemplative, measured pace. One of the most practically relevant questions raised by this text across virtually every tradition that has engaged with it is this: what extinguishes the fire? In the ancient tabernacle context, the answer was straightforward. The fire went out when no one tended it, when the wood ran out, when the priests were absent or negligent, or when the community's collective spiritual focus drifted. The history records at least one notable tradition about the fire being extinguished. During the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, the temple was destroyed and all its sacred objects were either taken or lost. According to certain later traditions, a group of priests hid the altar fire, or the coals, to preserve them. The second book of Maccabees, chapter 1, contains a fascinating account, possibly legendary in nature according to many historians, in which Nehemiah reportedly recovered a kind of sacred oil, or thick liquid, that, when poured on the wood of a reconstructed altar, ignited when the sun touched it. The text interprets this as a miraculous restoration of the original divine fire. Whether read as literal history or as theological narrative, the story carries the same message. When the fire is lost, the hope is that it can be recovered. Spiritually speaking, the traditions that have engaged most deeply with Leviticus 6 identify several fire extinguishers, patterns that in their interpretation gradually cool the inner flame. Neglect. Not active opposition, but the passive drift of attention away from what matters. The fire doesn't need to be actively attacked to go out. It only needs to be ignored. Unprocessed grief or disillusionment. Many spiritual writers have noted that profound disappointment, if left unaddressed, can harden into what medieval Christian mystics called acedia, a kind of spiritual dullness or emptiness, not quite despair, but a losing of warmth. Isolation. In the ancient priestly tradition, the fire was ancient priestly tradition. The fire was a communal responsibility. The priests took turns, the community gathered around it. And the fire was, in a sense, social. Many traditions have observed that spiritual vitality, whatever form it takes, tends to diminish in isolation. Routine without intention to, this is perhaps the most subtle. The priests who added wood to the altar every morning could have done so mechanically by rote without awareness. The physical action could persist while the inner participation faded. According to the interpretation of many teachers across traditions, this is possibly the most common way the inner fire dims, not through dramatic failure, but through the slow erosion of meaning in repeated acts. Part 6. The fire as spiritual metaphor across traditions. Music opens up slightly, broader, a more universal tone. It is worth pausing here to note how widely the inner fire metaphor appears across human, spiritual and philosophical traditions. Not to flatten their differences, but to recognize a common intuition that appears to surface independently in widely separated cultures. In the Sufi tradition of Islam, the concept of ishq, divine love or longing, is frequently described using fire imagery. The 13th century Persian poet Rumi, whose work has been translated and read across cultures, returns again and again to the metaphor of the flame, the soul as a candle, the divine as the light it reaches toward, and love as the burning that is simultaneously painful and necessary. In Hindu devotional tradition, particularly in the practice of aarti and the offering of light before a deity, fire is understood as a living symbol of the divine presence made visible. The flame moves, it responds, it cannot be fully controlled, and devotees are invited to bring their palms close to it and then touch their own foreheads, a gesture of receiving the warmth and carrying it into themselves. Buddhist traditions, while generally more cautious about fire imagery, due to its association with desire and craving in the Four Noble Truths, nonetheless use flame extensively as a symbol for awareness itself. The concept of dukkha, suffering, is sometimes explained using the metaphor of friction, heat, and burning. And the path of liberation is sometimes described not as extinguishing all fire, but as transforming consuming flames into the steady, out-clear light of wisdom. In indigenous traditions across North America, Africa, and Oceania, the sacred fire is typically understood as a living being, an ancestor or mediating spirit that must be treated with the respect due a living presence. Fire ceremonies in many of these traditions involve careful protocols for building, maintaining, and, when necessary, closing the fire in a way that honors its nature. The point of this survey is not to suggest that all these traditions say the same thing. They do not. But the recurrence of the fire metaphor suggests something deeply human about this image, a universal recognition that something important within us can be kept alive, can be nurtured, can be lost through neglect, and can possibly be rekindled. Now, Part 7, the morning ritual, daily practice. As the key, music becomes grounded, practical, warm. Let's return to the specific text of Leviticus 6:12. The priest shall burn wood on it every morning. Every morning. This timing is not incidental. In the liturgical structure of the ancient tabernacle, the morning was the beginning of the sacrificial day. Before the first offering was made, before any other religious activity took place, the priest's first act was to check the fire and feed it, According to the interpretation of many scholars and spiritual teachers, this sequence is itself the instruction. First things first, the fire was not attended to after everything else was done. It was not an afterthought. It was the foundation on which everything else rested. If the fire wasn't burning, no offering could be made, no bread could be kept warm, no incense could be consumed. The whole system of worship depended on the fire being alive. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the late chief rabbi of the United Kingdom and one of the most widely read Jewish thinkers of the 20th and 21st centuries, wrote extensively about the concept of renewal in Jewish practice. He suggested in various essays and talks that the greatness of Jewish law was not that it demanded extraordinary acts of faith on rare occasions, but that it built faith into the fabric of ordinary time, morning prayers, evening prayers, blessings before eating, blessings after eating, weekly Sabbath, small, repeated acts that over a lifetime formed a person. According to his interpretation, and the interpretation of many in similar traditions, the power was not in any single moment of intense devotion. The power was in the returning, every morning, again. This perspective has resonated with readers across secular and spiritual traditions alike. Psychologists who study habit formation have noted that consistent small behaviors, practiced without expectation of immediate reward, tend to shape identity over time more durably than intense episodic experiences. The morning routine is not just a religious idea, it appears from multiple angles of study to be a structurally important practice for any form of inner cultivation. Whether one reads Leviticus 6:12 in its original religious context or through a more broadly philosophical lens, the core teaching seems to be the same. You cannot live off yesterday's fire. Part 8. When the fire seems to have gone out, music becomes softer, pastoral, compassionate. It would be dishonest to talk about keeping a fire burning without acknowledging what happens when, as most people experience at some point, it seems to have gone out entirely. There are seasons, be in any serious spiritual life, in any deeply held commitment, when the warmth is simply not felt. When the practices that once sparked something now feel hollow. When the words that once carried weight now seem dry on the page. This experience is so universal in spiritual literature that it has its own vocabulary in almost every tradition. In Christian mystical tradition, it is called the dark night of the soul, a phrase derived from the 16th century Spanish mystic John of the Cross, who described periods of spiritual aridity not as failures but as necessary passages. According to his interpretation, the darkness was not an absence of the divine, it was the withdrawal of consolation so that the soul could learn to trust something deeper than feeling. In Jewish tradition, similar experiences are discussed under the concept of hestapanim, the hiding of the face of God. The Hebrew Psalms are full of these laments, raw, unfiltered expressions of feeling abandoned, of crying out and receiving no response. Psalm 22 begins, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Words that most traditions understand as authentic expressions of human anguish within a relationship that has not ended, but feels inaccessible. In Buddhist practice, periods of dryness or lack of motivation in meditation are well documented and have been written about extensively by teachers in the Theravada, Zen, and Tibetan traditions. The general counsel is not to force an emotion that isn't present, but to show up anyway, to do the practice without demanding the result. What unites these varied responses is a shared conviction. The fire goes underground sometimes. The ember is not extinguished, it is covered. And the instruction, bring wood every morning, does not say bring wood every morning when you feel inspired. It says every morning. The act of bringing the wood is the act of faith that the fire is still there, still capable of catching. Part 9. Practical implications. How do you tend an inner fire? Music becomes more engaged, thoughtful, encouraging. At this point, it seems right to ask if we accept any version of this metaphor, whether in a strictly religious framework, a broadly spiritual one, or even a purely psychological reading. What does it actually look like to tend the fire? The ancient priestly instruction had 3 components that are worth examining. 1. Show up in the morning. The timing matters. According to the text, the fire was tended at the beginning of the day, before the day's other demands had accumulated. This structural placement is interpreted by many teachers as suggesting that inner cultivation, whatever form it takes, benefits from prioritization. Not squeezing it into leftover time, but making it the first threshold crossed. Practically, this might mean morning prayer, meditation, like journaling, reading, silence. Any practice that creates a deliberate space of orientation before the reactive momentum of the day begins. 2. Add wood intentionally. The wood is described as being arranged or laid on the altar, not dumped randomly. In the Hebrew, the verb used carries a sense of purposeful placement. The priest didn't just throw things on the fire, he tended it with care and attention. According to many spiritual teachers across traditions, this attention is not optional. Practices done mechanically without presence are like throwing wet wood on a fire. They may smother rather than feed. The quality of attention brought to any practice is, according to most interpretive traditions, as important as the practice itself. 3. I trust the origin of the fire. This is perhaps the most distinctive element of the Leviticus passage. The fire was not originally produced by human effort. It descended, it was received, and all subsequent tending was in response to something already given. This theological conviction, that the fire is not created by human will but responded to, has practical implications in the interpretive traditions that hold it. It removes the crushing pressure of having to manufacture devotion from scratch. The responsibility is not to generate the fire, it is to not let it go out. For those who read this in a secular or psychological register, the equivalent insight might be this: deep motivation, deep love, deep creative energy. These things are not sustainably manufactured by willpower. They arise, they are cultivated, and they respond to conditions. Your role is not to force them into existence, but to create and maintain the conditions in which they can remain alive. Part 10. The fire in the community. Shared responsibility. Music stays warm, communal feel. One final dimension of the Leviticus passage deserves attention before we close. The fire was not one priest's personal responsibility. The priestly community took turns. There were multiple priests, multiple shifts, a structured rotation of care. According to the interpretation of many historians of ancient religion, this shared responsibility was itself part of the theology. No single individual could maintain perpetual devotion alone. The fire was a collective commitment, an ongoing expression of the whole community's orientation toward what they understood as sacred. And this has been noted by many spiritual writers and teachers as a corrective to hyper-individualized understandings of the spiritual life. Whatever inner flame a person carries is not meant to be maintained in isolation. It needs community, accountability, shared practice, and the warmth of others' fires. There is a well-known teaching. Its exact origin is disputed, but it appears in various forms across African, indigenous, and monastic traditions that describes how a single coal removed from a fire grows cold quickly, while the same coal kept among others stays lit. The image is almost certainly older than any single tradition that claims it. It touches something universally recognized. For many people, a significant part of what keeps the fire burning is not a private inner discipline alone, but participation in something larger than the individual's self. A community, a practice, a relationship, a vocation. The priests tended the fire together. No single one of them could have kept it burning indefinitely alone. Now, closing, music returns to opening tone. Warm, quiet, reverent. Leviticus 6:12 and 13 are two short verses in the middle of a long, technical book of ancient priestly law. And yet, across millennia of interpretation, across Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and broader human reflection, they have been read and reread as containing something essential. Not a mystery to be solved, not a prophecy to be decoded, just a quiet, daily instruction: the fire shall not go out. Add wood every morning. Whether you receive that as a literal religious command, a spiritual metaphor, a psychological principle, or simply a beautiful ancient image, the core invitation seems to be the same. Pay attention to what matters most to you. Show up for it consistently. Don't wait until the fire has gone cold to tend it. Bring the wood now, today, in the small acts that most people around you will never see. That, according to the interpretation of centuries of thoughtful people across many traditions, is what it means to keep the fire burning. Thank you for watching. If this kind of reflective, historically grounded content is meaningful to you, consider sharing it with someone who might find it valuable. All perspectives shared here are presented for educational and cultural reflection and represent a range of interpretive traditions, not a single doctrinal claim.